Castrovalva. Whilst on location at Buckhurst Park in Withyham, the cast and crew hosted a party on the first night. Matthew Waterhouse indulged far too greatly, and found himself feeling very poorly during the next day's recording. Indeed, immediately after shooting Castrovalva's final scene, he proceeded to vomit against the nearest tree. 4 to Doomsday. Matthew Waterhouse, who had endured a difficult working relationship with Tom Baker, got off to a bad start with Peter Davison as well, after he took it upon himself to point out mistakes he felt that his new colleague was making. Kinder. The presence of Nyssa generated a greater difficulty for writer Christopher Bailey. His narrative could not accommodate a third companion, and he and script editor Chris Bidmead were concerned that it would be adversely impacted if they made the wholesale changes necessary to include her. Consequently, it was agreed that Nyssa would appear at the start and end of the serial, but be written out of the main action. This echoed a common practice on Doctor Who throughout the 60s, when members of the regular cast would be omitted from an episode once or twice per season in order for them to afford a week's holiday. The Visitation. One milestone that producer John Nathan Turner asked Eric Saward to incorporate into his script was the destruction of the Doctor's sonic screwdriver. John Nathan Turner viewed the device as an overly convenient plot contrivance. He thought that doing away with the sonic screwdriver would challenge Doctor Who's scriptwriters to be more imaginative in devising ways for the Doctor to solve problems, and would also make the Time Lord seem less invulnerable. After he was cast as a new Doctor in late 1980, Peter Davison came to share his producer's opinion. He felt that it would be more interesting if the Doctor instead carried an assortment of everyday objects in his pockets, which he could use in inventive ways to get out of trouble. Black Orchid. On October 6, the stunt in which George Cranley plummeted off the roof went a little wrong. Stuntman Gareth Milne missed his cushion target and struck the ground with his legs, but he escaped serious injury. Earthshock. The Radio Times offered Doctor Who a front cover to promote the return of the Cybermen, the first that they would get since 1973 with the Time Warrior, but John Nathan Turner was keen to keep their appearance a secret, and these plans were scrapped. Time Flight. Script editor Eric Saward felt that the Master had worn out his welcome. He championed the idea of killing him off in this story, but John Nathan Turner was adamant that he wanted the Master to be a recurring foe for the foreseeable future. Given how he's written in this story, you can't really blame Eric Saward for this. Arc of Infinity. Writer Johnny Byrne was already toying with an idea in which an alien used a bridge between dimensions called the Arc of Infinity to induce time shifts in London. Johnny Byrne felt that this concept could be relocated to Amsterdam, and it was suggested that a vacationing Tegan might stumble upon some form of criminal activity which would require the Doctor's attention. The production team stipulated that this should not involve drug smuggling, the theft of diamonds, or old Dutch masters, or anything political. Just use the location, Amsterdam. Snake Dance. Writer Christopher Bailey infused the names he chose for Snake Dance with hidden meanings. Buddhist terms again made an appearance here, inspiring Menusa, meaning the human realm, Tana, craving, and Dugdale, from Dugatai, unhappy existence. Doshen was an homage to Dogen, a master of Zen Buddhism who lived in 13th century Japan. Dugdale had earlier been called Dukkhan, a platform used by Hebrew priests, while Chela was named for a Hindi word meaning religious disciple. Mordrin Undead. Ian Chesterton was originally due to make an appearance in this story, but due to scheduling conflicts, William Russell couldn't reprise his role, resulting in the Brigadier making his return. Whilst it's a shame William Russell couldn't return, this would mean he would never have won his world record for longest time between TV appearances in 2022. Terminus. In writing Terminus, writer Steve Gallagher took inspiration from Norse mythology, naming the Vanir after a lesser group of fertility gods. Of the individual members, Bor was the father of Odin, head of the Norse pantheon. Sigurd was a great Norse hero, also known as Siegfried or Sigurd Snesvend, and Eric was originally called Eric after a king of Norway and Northumbria, also known as Eric Haraldsson or Eric Bloodaxe. Similarly, the Garm was named for a monstrous hellhound, also known as Garma, who appeared during the time of Ragnarok, the twilight of the Norse gods. Meanwhile, the term Lazar was an archaic word for leper. It was derived from the biblical figure of Lazarus, described in the Gospel of John as having died from an illness, only to be resurrected 4 days later by Jesus. Enlightenment. The shot of Turlough jumping overboard did not go as planned. The harness supporting Mark's Striction malfunctioned, leaving him walking with discomfort for several weeks. The King's Demons. As work began on The King's Demons, a grim pall hung over Doctor Who, and indeed the BBC as a whole. The Electricians' Union had been threatening strike action for weeks, and the picket lines finally went up in early November. As a result, Enlightenment, the story which immediately preceded The King's Demons, was suspended in mid-production, its pre-filming having been completed, but its studio days indefinitely postponed. Concern now arose that both The King's Demons and the Dalek story to follow, intended to be the finale, would have to be abandoned. Fortunately, the industrial dispute was resolved in late November. John Nathan Turner decided to preserve the original recording dates for The King's Demons to avoid the expense of extending the contracts for those involved. However, it was too late to completely salvage the season. Enlightenment would have to be finished during the studio dates originally meant for the Dalek story, and now the Dalek story is delayed to season 21, eventually becoming Resurrection of the Daleks. The Five Doctors. The target novelisation of The Five Doctors was originally scheduled for release on November 24th, with the understanding that this would be the day after transmission. Producer John Nathan Turner was very frustrated to discover that it actually began appearing on shop shelves 2 weeks early. If you were around during 1983, do let me know in the comments if you read the novelisation before the story aired. Warriors of the Deep. In May, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher called a snap election for June 9th, taking advantage of her popularity in the wake of the Falklands War. The announcement caught BBC planning by huge surprise, and facilities had to be swiftly reallocated to accommodate election coverage. Amongst these casualties of this development was Warriors of the Deep. John Nathan Turner was informed that the first studio block would have to be brought forward by a week, or else the serial would be cancelled. A labour dispute had resulted in the loss of one story, The Return, from Doctor Who's 20th season, and John Nathan Turner was determined that season 21 would not be similarly abbreviated. Left with no other option, the producer agreed to accommodate the new dates. This decision was met with trepidation by the visual effects department, with concern raised that the costume for the Merker could not be completed within the revised schedule. And it certainly shows on screen. The Awakening. Keith Jane's character, the young 17th century peasant Will Chandler, became very popular with the cast and crew. Some consideration was given to retaining Will as a companion, but John Nathan Turner and Eric Saywood finally decided that he would not have a lasting appeal for viewers. Frontios. Barry Dobbins was given the job of designing Frontios. However, significant concerns arose regarding Dobbins' mental health, and so he was replaced by David Buckingham in early July. Sadly, Dobbins committed suicide soon after. Dobbins' death was not the only tragedy which touched Frontios. As Mr. Range, director Ron Jones cast veteran actor Peter Arne. On August 1st, he had his costume fitting for the series and then returned home. Soon after, neighbours reported a violent argument in Arne's apartment, and the police arrived to find that he had been beaten to death. Several days later, a body was pulled from the Thames which was identified as that of a vagrant with whom Arne was acquainted with. An inquest determined that the vagrant had murdered Arne and then drowned himself, although the motive has never been made clear. The role of Mr. Range was hastily recast, with William Lucas taking over the role. Resurrection of the Daleks. Had Resurrection of the Daleks followed the normal transmission schedule for season 21, it would have aired on Thursday and Fridays in 1984, between February 9th and 17th. However, these dates coincided with the BBC broadcast of the Winter Olympics from Sarajevo, Yugoslavia, meaning that Doctor Who would be displaced by Olympic Grandstand. John Nathan Turner was not keen to see the season split in half, and there was an alternative that suggested itself. Doctor Who at the time was the only half-hour drama remaining at the BBC, and since the spring of 1983, plans had been afoot to reformat the programme for a 45-minute time slot beginning in 1985. On November 22nd, it was agreed that Resurrection of the Daleks would serve as a test for this change, with a re-edited version of the serial screened as a pair of 45-minute episodes on consecutive Wednesdays. Planet of Fire. On the last night in Lanzarote, actors Dallas Adams and Peter Wingard liberated some turtles kept in the hotel pool and released them into the sea, causing the police to be summoned. The Caves of Androzani. Graham Harper was an ambitious director in recruiting his cast for this serial, and especially in his search for an actor with a distinctive voice to portray Sharaz Jek. Amongst others, Harper approached Tim Curry, known for playing Transylvanian transvestite Dr. Frank N. Furter in the Rocky Horror Picture Show, and aspired to attract the interest of rock stars like Mick Jagger and David Bowie. In the end, the part went to ballet dancer Christopher Gable, who had originally been considered for Salatine. Harper wanted to offer the role of Krelper to Michael Craze, who had played companion Ben Jackson in 1966 and 1967. However, John Nathan Turner had been unhappy with the results of a similar experiment in 1980, when original Doctor Who star Jacqueline Hill played a new character in Meglos. He told Graham Harper to hire someone else, and Roy Holder would ultimately portray Krelper. And that's all from me. Join me next time where we'll be going through facts from the Sixth Doctor era. Goodbye.